We are 2 weeks out from Election Day, and former President Donald Trump was just slapped with another lawsuit. The Central Park Five are suing Donald Trump for defamation. The group is accusing the former president of making false and defamatory statements about them during last month's presidential debate with Vice President Harris in front of 67 million people. The group wrote, quote, "Trump falsely stated that plaintiffs killed an individual and pled guilty to the crime. These statements are demonstrably false." But of course, the history between Trump and the Central Park Five goes all the way back to 1989, when 5 teenagers who were Black and Latino were accused of the 1989 rape and beating of a white woman jogger in Central Park. The 5 said they confessed to the crime under duress. They later recanted, but were convicted after jury trials. After the crime, Trump purchased a full-page ad in the New York Times calling for a reinstatement to the death penalty. It was Trump's first foray into tough-on-crime politics. The Central Park Five's convictions were vacated in 2002 after another person confessed to the crime.
Here's the clip the Central Park Five are suing over. Let's watch.
Going back many, many years, when a lot of people, including Mayor Bloomberg, agreed with me on the Central Park Five, they admitted, they said, they pled guilty. And I said, well, if they pled guilty, they badly hurt a person, killed a person ultimately. And if they pled guilty, then they pled, we're not guilty.
The problem was no victim died, and Trump conflated confessions with guilty pleas.
A Trump spokesman called the suit, quote, "just another frivolous election interference lawsuit filed by desperate left-wing activists in an attempt to distract the American people from Kamala Harris's dangerously liberal agenda and failing campaign." Meanwhile, one of the 5, New York City Council member Yusuf Salaam, shared his thoughts on CNN. Let's watch.
What's it like to see him doing what he's doing now 35 years later?
You know, when I think about a person like Donald Trump who is using his power to influence judgment, you know, I follow a faith as a Muslim that tells us that we shouldn't use our power to influence judgment. And here it is, 35 years ago for me, 1989, what he did by placing that ad in New York City's newspapers had a domino effect where people, the way I describe it really is that it was a whisper into the darkest enclaves of society for them to do to us what they had done to Emmett Till.
What do you think, Amber?
Well, I can tell you the people on this panel aren't going to like what I have to say about this. I'm in agreement with Donald Trump on the Central Park Five.
You think they're guilty?
I do, 100%.
Based on what?
Based on the fact that all 5 of them separately admitted to having involvement in the beating and rape of this woman. And many of the details that they testified to in these meetings with police officers were confirmed by the evidence that was later collected at the scene. There were dozens of other witnesses in Central Park that day who all fingered these guys as having involvement. And we say in the opening read that they were exonerated by DNA evidence, but that's not exactly what happened. What happened was the prosecutors in this case actually always knew that there was another perpetrator that they had not caught, and this was brought up during the jury trial. And so when Mr. Reyes came forward and said that he was the one who actually raped the woman, the others should not have been exonerated as having beaten her, helped to hold her down. Some of them had actually admitted to the fact that they were masturbating or trying to get hard while they were watching what was happening to this woman. So the DNA evidence was taken from the woman's cervix and proved that Reyes was the one who actually penetrated her and ejaculated in her, but there was no indication that they should have been exonerated because nothing related to the DNA evidence proved that they weren't there.
I mean, one of them was convicted of murder, and the others were convicted of rape, so given that neither
right,
of
and
them
that's why the convictions had to be vacated, because the DNA evidence exonerated them from the rape and murder.
Yeah, so
but they were absolutely involved in the beating, in the sexual assault.
So my view is, from looking at the case, is I have questions about whether they were involved in that aspect. Now, that night, there was a whole group of people going through Central Park. There were a number of violent actions that took place. There was a bicyclist who got really badly beat up. That film that came out recently on Netflix really made light of the other crimes that were engaged.
Salaam admitted to having the lead pipe that was used to hit both the cyclist and the jogger.
Their denials of the involvement with that kind of stuff came much later, and I find less believable. I do think there are enough serious questions about their involvement in the joggers' altercation to have them be you know, released from prison and all of that kind of thing, because the guy who did have the actual semen was found had a history of operating as a lone wolf. I'm not sure I'm persuaded that they were involved. Their confessions, you know, they were separated, they were young. That the film does portray that part where, you know, if the police interrogate you for 10 hours, people do confess to things they didn't do because it's a, you know, psychologically disturbing kind of ordeal to go through. So I am not, so I would not claim that they were guilty in the central aspect of the thing. I think some of the other details of that night are often not told in the media imagining where they are more likely to have been involved. Not
to mention, these were men of color in a time when the city was so afraid of anything, and that's why the media's handling of this and the police, who have a history of this in New York City, of targeting young black men, and I mean, whether it was stop and frisk much later or in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with the crime rates, I mean, these were men who could not afford, boys who could not afford proper representation. And so if you're sitting there separated and you're a teenager, you're separated from the other guys, and you're being forced by the police into basically admitting, and then later, only later do you realize that you might have had a pathway out if you had proper representation.
This was 1989 when crime in New York City was much more serious than it was. More than twice as many violence, crimes, shootings, etc. Nationwide. The crime peaked nationwide in 1993, 1994, and then did start to come down. So the public panic about crime was at that time well calibrated to the fact that crime was the highest it had ever been, like, you know, as far as they were keeping statistics on violence in America.
But we still have a justice system. So while fear might be high and crimes might be high, it doesn't mean that you just throw out multiple different allegations and arrest whoever you want. And that was the problem with the justice system, to this day, by the way, it's still in New York City. And, you know, it wasn't just the media outrage. I mean, there were the political games that were being played at this time, they were being used as a weapon politically in New York politics. And it was an election year, if I recall, and they became the centerpiece of some deeper stuff that was happening in the city at the time.
It's a reminder that the whole, you know, you kind of tried to talk about it just as a race thing. At the time, Linda Fairstein, who was the prosecutor who brought them to justice, she was viewed as a feminist icon and hero for protecting women. And so I think that goes to show you how some of these kinds of aspects of the intersectional hierarchy of wokeness are actually kind of in tension. I mean, black males are overrepresented in people who are accused of sexual crimes and violent crimes on campuses, just in general. And, you know, Me Too, believe all women, but then, well, I don't know, because also we have to
that's why we have laws and a justice system, and that's why our justice system should be fair and equitable. But to force these people into being convicted, and, you know, before a jury that is feeling the fear in New York City at the time and reading the news, it doesn't have to be about them, but other news, that's how we get into this situation. And, I mean, I don't think you just round up whoever you want because they make you feel funny.
They weren't just round up, you know, willy-nilly. There were, again, other witnesses in the park on that rampage on that night who identified all 5 of these suspects as being with them throughout the rampage and participating in the bludgeoning of this female jogger. And when Salam took the stand specifically during his trial, he had a lawyer paid for by his mother. He said that he was carrying a 14-inch metal pipe, which was the same type of weapon used to bludgeon both a male school teacher and the female jogger, and also claimed that he believed his DNA would have been left on the jogger's body. During his interrogation by the police, a police officer did a classic tactic where he said, "We are going to be recovering fingerprints from this woman's shirt, and if they come back and they're not your fingerprints, then you'll be free to go. But if they are your fingerprints, you might want to tell us now if you were involved in this." All of a sudden, he says, "Well, I was there, but I didn't rape her. I only held her down." There was another individual who testified that they had a hard time getting an erection because of all of the blood and the feces that was coming from her beating. Antron McCrae said, "We charged her, we got her on the ground, everybody started hitting her and stuff. She was on the ground, everybody stopping and everything. I grabbed one arm, some other kid grabbed one arm, and we grabbed her legs and stuff. Another
Amber,
individual who was interrogated said the exact same thing, that they held down her legs.
We could do this all day long,
arms.
and these statements were all put before a court of law, and they were stated they made
and they were convicted
under duress, and that's why later they were exonerated. When you put people under duress, and also DNA was flawed at the time, deeply flawed. Witness testimony is the least reliable form of testimony. This was supposedly
they were exonerated because someone else came forward, said they did it, and that person's DNA, and that they did it alone, and that person's DNA was fine. That's why they were exonerated.
So, right, because they didn't have DNA of the other individuals, because the DNA evidence at that time was
so weak.
Correct.
So to say that they should have stayed in court and then continued to be convicted after they were exonerated, in which you also have to overcome a burden of proof. You have to poke holes at the story. So if their testimony was already flawed because it was under duress, and all those quotes you just said were not
there was a lot
accurate.
of exaggeration as to the interrogation tactics of the police, and even in their lawsuit, a lot of the things that were presented in this film by Ava DuVernay were complete exaggerations and falsehoods. They were never denied food. The timeline was completely inaccurate. They didn't bring any of this in their lawsuit against the city. So I think there's just a misunderstanding of exactly what happened here. And how would it be that all 5 of them were interrogated under duress, and yet all 5 of their stories were incredibly consistent and matched all of the evidence at the scene?
That's based on your conclusion. That is not based on the law's conclusion. Very important.
And the conclusion that the jury reached.
It was correct. I would say it was correct to exonerate them based on DNA evidence being found that did match one other person who said they acted alone. But I don't think...
you can't prove the rape because none of them admitted to raping her, right? They all said that they held her down, they pinned the rape on other people. The only person who should have been convicted of the rape was Reyes. But I contend that they were absolutely involved in this attack.
The bottom line is I don't think it's defamation to have that opinion, as Donald Trump does. So we'll see how that lawsuit fares. I would expect not very well. Coming up next, we have an update on the situation in the Middle East. More Rising right after this.